Welcome back. Still tuned in to Salam Media with myself, Salalo Makwidere. We're about 2 minutes before the top of the hour, 9 a.m. And I will be shifting our focus right now to Palestine and the ongoing genocide perpetrated by the Israeli occupying forces. And the big news coming out of there is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced the end of Israel's six-member war cabinet. Reports on Monday said the Israeli leader had announced the decision at a meeting of the Political Security Cabinet the previous evening. Netanyahu's far-right coalition partners have been pushing for a new war cabinet to be established after the more centrist Benny Gantz quit the emergency government. And joining us right now to unpack that is director of Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Prof, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Salam Media.
Thanks for having me.
Really big news coming out of Israel. First and foremost, if you can just give us a bit more insight on this war cabinet and what it comprised of.
Well, the war cabinet has completely lost any meaning now. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter that it's over. The war cabinet was an attempt to do two things. One, to bring in Benny Gantz and ICAHD, his partner, two very vicious generals, as so-called moderates, in order to moderate the influence of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are super right-wing members of the cabinet. And by doing a smaller war cabinet, you could keep them out, and they'd simply be in the larger cabinet that didn't have direct decision-making in terms of the war effort itself. But basically, the war is over. I think this is the big news. It's done. Israel's done what it set out to do, basically. It hasn't got the hostages back, but it can always negotiate. It's assaulted Gaza. It's destroyed Gaza. It's invaded Rafah. That was supposed to be the red line for everyone. Mm-hmm. It defined the ICJ that never followed up on its genocide. It has defied the ICC, who has never really issued arrest warrants. It's defied the Security Council with no sanctions whatsoever. And it still gets American weaponry and international support. So with all South Africa's great and good and appreciated efforts, it's over, basically. Israel's done what it's wanted to do. The only thing that it hasn't had total victory, okay. It hasn't killed Sinwar yet, okay. But it's basically, the army says we have basically destroyed the military capacity of Hamas. And from our point of view, it's over. That's what the military is telling the government. So Gantz and ICAHD left because there's nothing else to moderate. There's nothing else to do. It's over. They failed in terms of any moderation. But these are two guys that completely supported everything. They weren't really moderating forces. So now basically we're back to the government. We're back to normality. And the only argument today is when exactly will the fighting end? Is it going to end tomorrow? Is it going to end next week? Netanyahu has an interest, of course, in perpetuating it because he wants to perpetuate his government. But in terms of military objectives, it's over. It's done from the point of view of the military. Now the only issue becomes the hostages, and Gantz has nothing to do with that.
And I think, you touch on something very, very important. The fact that we don't know exactly, when there'll be that ceasefire and, quote unquote, peace prospects. There've been numerous calls, for that, for ceasefire, for negotiations with Hamas. What are the key obstacles, in initiating such discussions, and how crucial are these steps for achieving long-term peace in the region?
I think the crucial thing is that the international community, with all its criticism, basically lets Israel do what it wants to do. I think Israel is a very important member of the international community. I wrote a book called War Against the People that shows how Israel supplies weaponry, surveillance, all kinds of policing technologies of repression to governments all over the world. So on one level, they'll criticize Israel, but they're not going to sanction Israel. And that Israel knows. There's no sanctions. And so basically, it's a wink. The international community saying you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this, international law, human rights. But at the same time, it allows it to do it. It keeps arming Israel. And Israel knows that. So the failure is not only the will of the governments to I mean, Israel's a little tiny country. The United States tomorrow could stop the ammunition and stop the war if it wanted to, but the United States supports this war, you know? And so what it really shows, I think, is the ineffectiveness of the international system of international law. The fact that international law means nothing. It's wonderful text, it's wonderful language, but there is no enforcement. You know, the ICJ, the ICC, the Security Council, no one has enforced international law that Israel is clearly, blatantly in violation of. And that's the failure. I think that's what we should take away from this, besides the genocide. I mean, a genocide is happening before our eyes, and the international community isn't powerless to stop it. It could stop it tomorrow morning if it had the international will and if its system of international law was in fact enforceable. But it isn't, because everything is up to political leaders, and it really gets down to the United States and Biden, and that's where the whole thing falls apart. We're not living in an international system. We're living in a neo-colonial world where the United States right now exists, at least on this issue, prevails, with NATO and Europe behind it, of course.
And we've seen Benny Gantz, heavily criticizing the Israeli government for lacking a post-war plan for Gaza. What should a comprehensive and quote unquote just war plan for Gaza include? What would it look like, from an Israeli point of view?
I don't know. I mean, what Israel would like is to get rid of Gaza. Gaza is taken over by the international community, maybe by an Arab peacekeeping force, somebody not Palestinian, and somebody not Israeli. Some force comes in to take it over, although Israel will keep overall security control, of course, and they deal with it. They put in the billions of dollars that are needed for cleanup. Just the cleanup of Gaza is estimated to take 5 years. Resettlement, feeding the people. Israel will not pay 1 penny of any of that. So that's its plan for afterwards. Somebody to take over administratively, somebody to pay for all the damage, somebody to deal with the humanitarian issues. And then Israel goes on with what it really wants to do, which is not Gaza. Gaza is marginal for Israel. It was an attempt that I think maybe successful, I don't know, to quash the last bastion of resistance, armed resistance of the Palestinians. Maybe it's done that. I don't know what Hamas's situation is. But politically, it's much more interested in the West Bank. The settlements are continuing. The expulsion of Palestinians from the villages in the West Bank is continuing. And the normalization process with the Sunni Arab world is continuing. That's really the outrageous part of this. Saudi Arabia is dying to normalize relations with Israel. The Gulf states, Egypt, the whole Sunni world is the pro-Western so-called Sunni world wants normalization. Normalization means legitimizing Israel's apartheid over the West Bank. It means erasing the Palestinians, really as a people, but certainly as a political force. And Israel's normalized in the Middle East. And so Gaza was I think they got away with it. They smashed Hamas. They did whatever they wanted to do in Gaza. They don't care really about the day after. Who cares? And they're getting their normalization with the Arab world. So Israel wins, basically. And that's the outrageous part. Genocide wins in this case.
Very, very concerning. And I would like us to focus a bit on, the internal politics and, the coalition dynamics. With the resignation of Benny Gantz and the current political dynamics in Israel, how stable is Netanyahu's coalition? I mean, we've seen the protests, that have been taking place in the streets of Tel Aviv. And what might this instability mean for future policies towards Gaza and, the broader Palestinian debacle?
Nothing will change. There is no difference. Gantz, I think that there'll be elections. Netanyahu and the Likud will probably be out. Gantz, although nobody's crazy about Gantz, he has no program, he has no personality. He's just not Netanyahu. That's the thing that Israelis want. Just get rid of Netanyahu. But the policies remain. I mean, it's interesting that these two guys are seen as the moderates somehow. Gantz ran for election in one of his campaigns a couple of years ago. He opened his campaign with a video saying, I killed 4,000 terrorists in Gaza. ICAHD, his buddy, was the general in Lebanon who decreed the Dahia doctrine. Dahia is the whole huge neighborhood in Beirut that's where most of the Shiite population lives, you know, and it was absolutely destroyed. And his Dahia doctrine says we will respond disproportionately to any, attack on the part of Arabs. In other words, international law says your response has to be proportionate to the threat. The Dahia doctrine says, the hell with international law, we're going to destroy everything. And Gaza is exactly that. Eisenkot's doctrine of the Dahia doctrine has been applied to Gaza. And now they might apply it to Beirut again. Don't forget, we're not at the end of this whole thing. We still have Hezbollah. Israel is beginning to say, the government's beginning to say, look, Hezbollah is a part of Lebanon. We're really in a conflict with Lebanon, not with Hezbollah in the north. Lebanon is throwing missiles at us through Hezbollah. And you're getting more and more Israeli generals and politicians saying Beirut should look like Gaza. And these are the moderates that are saying this. Eisenkot. So the Dahia doctrine has gone from a neighborhood in Beirut to Gaza and then back to all of Beirut and conceivably all of Lebanon. So that's where the Israeli government is going. And unless somehow we can mobilize the international community, maybe the peoples of the world that have risen up in a way to counter our government, because our governments are complicit in all of this, Israel's going to continue to win. It's been winning now for 76 years. And it has no reason to think that it's not going to continue to dictate what it wants to do, with the help of of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in Egypt and Morocco and
Yeah, I think a very, very concerning picture that you're painting there. But, just lastly, wrapping up, going forward, what can we look forward to? The war cabinet has been disbanded. Essentially, they're saying the war is over. What's next? What can we expect going forward as the international community continues watching without, not much involvement in the issue?
Well, what we're looking forward to is kind of the end, where Israel wins. If that's
what does that essentially look like? Does it look like
it's just what I said? Normalization, the Arab world and beyond. Basically, Israel. That means then normalization means that the status quo on the ground is accepted. What is it? You have Israel, the state of Israel, which is on 78% of Palestine. Plus the settlements. You've got 750,000 settlers in the West Bank. So all those settlements will be annexed to Israel. So Israel will basically expand to 85% of Palestine. The Palestinian population, the 6 or so million Palestinians, 7 million Palestinians, will be confined to, this in South Africa, to Bantustans, the little tiny disconnected enclaves. They'll disappear. The refugees will never come back. And this is normalized. In other words, this is the Arab world accepts it. Maybe not Syria at this point, or Lebanon, not Iran in terms of the Iranian world, but basically, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Egypt, Morocco, and so on will accept this normalization. And then Israel's home free, basically. There is no more pushback. And that's why we, the people that have really risen up against this genocide, we have, it's very, we can mobilize around something concrete, like the bombing of Gaza. All right, you can mobilize. But the big danger is something much more political and much more vague: normalization. The normalization is how settler colonialism wins. You see, The South African apartheid regime was never able to normalize its regime. Israel thinks, Israel, which has an apartheid regime today, we're your successor, thinks it can do it differently. We can normalize apartheid and get our apartheid system accepted internationally, including by the Arab world, in a way that South Africa couldn't. And then we win, and the Palestinians are gone. I mean, where are the Palestinians? They're locked into refugee camps forever or into these little enclaves. And that's where we're going, and that's what we have to mobilize against somehow.
I want to touch on that. How does now the conversation change? Because for the longest time, it has been, stop the genocide, stop the encroaching of, Israeli occupying forces into Palestinian territory. What do we say now? What's the discourse? Because essentially, as you say, it's normalization is going to start taking place. The state of Israel will be accepted in the region and ultimately throughout the world. What's the discourse now? What do we say? What do we rally behind as a next measure or recourse?
Two things, I think. One is end Israeli apartheid. We have to have a new global anti-apartheid campaign so that Israel is not able to normalize and legitimize its apartheid regime. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, all right, so then what? You see, I'm a part of an organization, Palestinian-led, called the One Democratic State Campaign. The only political program, in my view, in our view, that is going to resolve this in the end is one democratic state over all of historic Palestine. It's very much a South African solution, basically. Everyone becomes a citizen. Israel is no longer a Jewish state, although Israeli Jews can stay as equal citizens, of course. And you have one democratic state of equal rights for everyone. And that's and then you have Palestinians and Israelis having their national space within that, maybe, but it's one state for everyone. So it's a two-pronged campaign. One is to stop normalization and apartheid, and the second part is to go on and replace the apartheid state of Israel and the occupation with a democratic state to which then the refugees can come home. That, I think, is the two-pronged program that we should be focusing on. And I don't know if within the Muslim world, I mean, you're a Islamic radio station. I don't know within the Muslim world if pressures can be put quietly on Saudi Arabia in particular. That's the big, to pull back. The Arab street is certainly against what its governments are doing, but it's going ahead anyway. And somehow we've got to try to get to these governments that are very, as we all know, very autocratic and very closed, and try to say, no, you can't be complicit in this. It really soils, in my view, the Arab world. And, to the degree they represent Islam, the wider Islamic world becomes complicit in Israeli apartheid and genocide.
Prof, what would you say are some of the key failures, from the international community, from, activist bodies, that ultimately saw, I think by now, the success of, the ongoing genocide by Israeli occupying forces, and what lessons can be taken from there into the new discourse, into, the new proposed solutions for Palestine?
Well, I think, we're in a hard situation because, we have a monolithic world today. It's all a neoliberal world dominated by, right now at least, by the global north. The problem is a lot of the BRICS countries, that are trying to organize, they're not really very progressive either. I don't see the BRICS countries, China and Russia. I mean, you guys are an exception, but China, Russia, Brazil, India, certainly. India supports Israel completely in this. India is Israel's largest customer for arms. Israel is the number 2 arms supplier to China after Russia. So the BRICS are complicit in this. So there is no way to go, in a sense. The only oppositional forces are, first of all, the whole rule of international law. You have international laws against genocide, against apartheid, and so on, but they're unenforceable. And so they become symbolic. And that leaves everything in a way up to us, the people. Somehow we have to try to organize, and I don't know how that's going to happen, and go beyond the protests and go beyond, what's happening on campuses and the demonstrations and all of that, and really try to link up, I think, with the Palestinian people, because they're very isolated here. Find ways of linking up and creating some kind of a united front of opposition led by the Palestinians who are empowered, but able to mobilize the peoples of the world that really do support them. And in a way, the ANC did that in South Africa. And the FLN did that in Algeria, to work with the Palestinians to do that, because they're much more isolated and much more suppressed than I think the ANC was, or the FLN was even. This is, everybody says this is a worse situation even than apartheid. You can't compare, oppressive systems, of course, but the South African Air Force never bombed Soweto. Israel today is bombing the Tul Karm and Jenin refugee camps with the same massive military, armaments that it's bombing Gaza. So that the people of the world are the only real allies to the Palestinians. And we have to try to organize politically, again, establish working relationships with Palestinians here, and in that way, try to become a counterforce to an international system that is either pro-Israel or unable to enforce its own rules and laws.
Oh, Prof, painting a really, really bleak picture there, but I think we're going to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Really, really appreciate your insights.
All right. Thanks for having me on with that message. Bleak, but important.
Very bleak. Professor Jeff Halper, the co-founder and director of ICAHD. That's the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, a group that is opposed to Israeli settlements, which describe itself as an Israeli peace and human rights organization. I think, he's touching on something important there. There should be a change in the discourse and the approach right now, because we are in different territories. No longer, calling for the end of a genocide. The Israeli government essentially saying, well, they've achieved their objectives. They've disbanded their war cabinet, and they're saying, well, it's over. So it's time, I think, for the world, also for the pro-Palestine groups and activists and countries all across, to now start changing the conversation. What do we say now? What's the next step? Because the world essentially sat and did nothing as genocide prevailed, and the people of Palestine were essentially almost to a point of being wiped out. Going to take a quick break. I think this interview really kind of took the steam out of me, because essentially Professor Jeff Halper is telling us that it's done. It's done. The Israeli occupying forces are saying they've won. It's time to move on into something now. It's time to encroach, and start building, territories in previous Palestine lands. It's time to normalize relations with some of the Middle Eastern states around them, and that's something that's very, very probable. He mentions the likes of Saudi Arabia that are wouldn't mind the normalization of relations with the state of Israel, and he's saying they're essentially the people of Palestine will now be, refugees. They'll be in their little enclaves, what here in South Africa we used to call Bantustans, and that will be their reality. And ultimately, we might see the wiping out of, the state of Palestine and the Palestinian people, completely out of human memory and existence. Very, very sad and difficult, message to kind of swallow there. So, yeah. I think I'm going to take a quick break. We'll be coming back with more after this.